you very much, Kathleen, for inviting me, and I'm glad we managed to have the connection between the projector and my computer actually working now. And it's also a really great pleasure to be in Columbus for the first time. I'm really impressed with how lively the city is. I had a wonderful meal after midnight yesterday night in a street short north, I think. And the street was full of people. It's really wonderful to see such a metropolitan city. And we spent the afternoon at the Wexner Center, which I photographed because I'm going to talk about it in my class on Monday and Wednesday. And so this is all very exciting for me, and I wanted to, and I'm of course excited about the timing with your wonderful Terrell installation here, and my own interest in light and architecture, which I've had for a long time. Of course, it's a great coincidence. I very much look forward to seeing the installation tonight and see the building glow and change its color under the influence of the direction of James Turrell. But what I wanted to do here for the next 45 to 50 minutes is really put a little bit of a historical context around this installation and look at how architects and artists have worked with electric light as a medium and as a building material, if you like. And it of course begins, as you can imagine, with the arrival of electricity. There were, of course, the uses of light, candlelight, oil lamps, and gas light in the conjunction with architecture before, but only when you had electric light you could really plan for it and integrate it into the architecture. The whole story begins really in Paris in 1889 when electric light and arch lamps became available for the first time and could be integrated, as you can see here, in the Eiffel Tower. And the Eiffel Tower actually, by the way, it's quite interesting, had been intended as a light tower at first. Of course, these associations are clear. The World's Fair in 1889 celebrated the French Revolution 100 years earlier, and it also celebrated the Age of Enlightenment. So the idea of having a huge light tower was quite obvious, and many actually thought that they could replace all the street lamps in Paris once they had this enormous tower with the lights shining down, but then they figured out, you would be blinded by enormous beams of light in your face, and then you would turn a corner and it would be pitch black, of course. So, but they still use these wonderful arch lights, arc lamps, to pick out individual buildings on the exhibition grounds at the World's Fair in Paris in 1889. And they also demonstrated other forms of lighting, little light bulbs here at the edges, and even magnesium fires. You see the smoke coming out of different parts of the Eiffel Tower. So it was a demonstration of everything that light could do at the time. And as you can imagine, the next World's Fair in Chicago tried to outdo this instantly, and they had used much more wattage and much more light, of course, by integrating colored light not only into the buildings, as you can see here, around this artificial lagoon on the edges of Lake Michigan, but also in the fountains under the water, and made a very, very impressive spectacle. There are wonderful reports of people who came from the prairie to see the World's Fair in Chicago and fainted at the moment when the light went on in the evening because they had never seen anything like it. And Kathleen told me we'll try and be present at the conservatory tonight at exactly that same moment when the light comes on for the first time after sunset. So that I hope no one will faint at that moment, but we'll obviously see a very similar effect. And then the World's Fair in Paris, 1900, of course, takes it again a step further. This is also the moment when theoreticians and critics begin to think about light as a real building material that one has to take seriously. And there's a German art historian, a man called Ludwig Meyergräfer, and he walks across the exhibition ground at night and describes what he sees. And I think he makes a very, very compelling observation, and he says, and I quote him here, "Today already we can dream ourselves into the future if we wander through the exhibition grounds by night. Then the little putty and cornices, all the small and small-minded embellishments, vanish ghost-like in the dark. What remains are the large outlines, the enormous masses of this creation. All by itself, the night presents what we expect from the new architecture, concentration and greatness." And I thought that was really quite interesting. He walks around in the exhibition and talks about that the new architecture is visible already at night. It's not visible during the daytime, but at night you can see it, and it is a new architecture of concentration and greatness, which is of course exactly what 20, 30 years later, with the arrival of modernism, was one of the goals that architects tried to achieve. If we move on in our little history of the use of electric light, one could look, of course, at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901, where, as you can see here already, sequences of light bulbs, strings of light bulbs were integrated into the cornices of the buildings, and in fact the buildings were planned to have these illuminated lines, very beautiful, I think. And again, of course, the amount of electricity used for this enormous fair again outdid what had been used in Paris the year before. It was sort of a constant give and take, of course, between Europe and America at that point. And if we look a little further, we'll find that in San Francisco in 1915 at the Panama Pacific Exposition, a new technology was celebrated, and floodlights, in fact, were not only directed against the buildings so that their walls would reflect the light and they would stand out at night, but the designer of this electric spectacle at the fair, a man called Walter Darcy Ryan, who was the first lighting designer ever in the history of electric lighting, really. He worked for General Electric. He created these wonderful rainbow-colored beams in the night sky and was very proud of that invention. He called it the scintillator, which is a great term, I think, you know, the scintillator. And you see that here. And of course, we have to remind ourselves the years 1915 and the technology that he used for these enormous, powerful floodlights, of course, was not a technology that had been developed for the amusement of people who went to great World's Fairs and so on. It actually had been developed for warfare, and the year 1915 is, of course, 1 year after the First World War had already begun in Europe, and these floodlights had been invented for nocturnal maritime warfare or to illuminate the night sky to pick out enemy aircraft that might intrude and attack in the middle of the night. So this is really the motor behind this development. And another motor, of course, behind lighting technology and technology in general is commerce. And I wanted to quickly take a look at Times Square at that moment and show you what is going on there, because these different forces, of course, will accompany us through this short walk through the history of electric light as an artistic medium. So if we go to Times Square for a moment, I found this wonderful quote by a French visitor, a man called Pierre Loti, wonderful writer, and you see him here in this rather whimsical portrait by Henri Rousseau, the great painter. And Pierre Loti writes, when he sees Times Square, and I quote, "Everywhere multicolored lights sparkle, forming letters and then dissolving them again. But it is up in the air that one chiefly gazes, despite all the noise that goes on below, for up there, on the tops of the buildings, are signs that move, operated by ingenious mechanisms, visions that dance. Among these is a Roman chariot race in which gigantic horses are furiously swinging their hoofs of fire. A thread manufacturer shows an enormous yellow cat, unwinding a reel of red fire and winding itself up in the cotton. I'm immediately amused and even on the verge of admiration," he says. Well, he's French, you know, of course he was kind of trying to stay cool. Of course, he was totally blown away by what he saw. You know, he couldn't see that anywhere else but in Times Square. And I looked for a long time, and I finally found these images here of this little kitten. And of course, these long exposure images don't show you what happened. You have to imagine light bulbs would go on and often give us, like in a little movie, in a way, in a cartoon movie, the impression as if this cat would be playing around with this spool of Corticelli silk. So it was a very impressive spectacle. I found a film clip I wanted to show you from an old Hitchcock film, 1928, Blackmail. Not very well known, but it's a wonderful clip, and there is one of those moving advertisements that you could find, of course, either in Leicester Square, Piccadilly Circus, or in Times Square, of course. And if we just look at it, it's this young woman has just had a terrible night in which she had too much to drink and ended up in the home of a young man who tried to seduce her, and she quickly grabbed a knife and defended her. And so when she is back out in the street, she suddenly sort of looks at these advertisements, and it gives us a good example, I think, of what these things might have looked like. They're very rare nowadays, unfortunately. But this technology, of course, spread immensely and was to be found in all these sort of commercial centers in major cities in the
in the Western world. And in Times Square, in fact, soon people felt it was getting too much. And there was, in fact, in the mid-1920s, a movement against these advertisements. And in fact, I just picked a few essays from the New York Times, and you see here that there is an anti-billboard campaign, that people complain about unsightly billboards, that they are offenses to the eye, and that in fact the city decided to ban white lights in the Fifth Avenue region and around Times Square because there was a general feeling that they actually were too many and they were rather vulgar. And one shouldn't really have too many of those because they were disfiguring the architecture. In particular, of course, because the daytime view was not so pretty. And you all remember, of course, you know, these enormous scaffoldings on the roofs of buildings, which during nighttime could give you all these magical spectacles, but at day they are really very, very unsightly. And so this movement takes hold, and a general feeling that one needs a different way of advertising, and that this method of having moving letters and white bright lights is perhaps not the ultimate solution for the need to make your product known. And one man who came up with an immensely clever and a really wise solution was a man called William Wrigley. And William Wrigley, one of the great advertising men of the 20th century, of course, he made a fortune selling us a product that no one knew they needed in the first place. Right? and he also, of course, had an advertisement in Times Square. You see it here, Wrigley's, you know, and there were things moving, of course, and the letters were going on and off. But when he was building his new headquarters in Chicago, he decided he wouldn't have any advertising at all, no letters written, but do something entirely different. Use the architecture and lighting as his main tool of making himself known and seen around the world, pretty much. And he decided, and he worked with the architects and the lighting designer, Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White, who designed the buildings, on a scheme to have this entire facade floodlit with this floodlighting technology that I showed you earlier in bright white light. And he worked with the architects who, in fact, chose the terracotta in such a way that its hue changes from sort of beige to a bright white light at the top, because, of course, the light that you send against this facade changes in intensity as you go up. So you needed whiter terracotta at the top, so in the end the whole facade looks completely even white, and it was the brightest spot in the world. This image of the Wrigley headquarters went around the world, was published in every newspaper because it was so impressive, and without it saying Wrigley anywhere, everybody knew what it was. It was an amazing success, and William Wrigley even believed that the bright whiteness of the facade would somehow evoke in people's minds the fresh taste of spearmint somehow. And so it was a great advertising success, of course, and the first time that floodlighting was really used in this enormous scale in the heart of a city. Very shortly afterwards, a competition was held for a building across the street. Chicago was just expanding beyond the Chicago River, outside of the Loop, and a big Chicago company, the Chicago Tribune, of course, held an international competition for its new headquarters, a skyscraper, for this important newspaper. And this competition was won by a young man called Raymond Hood. And Raymond Hood, I believe, won this competition for this sort of Gothic-looking tower because he said in his entry, I know there is the Wrigley building right across the street, and it's the best lit and brightest building in the world, but I suggest that with my building, we will even have better and more interesting and more theatrical lighting. And of course, Chicago Tribune, the board of directors, knew they had to do something about this white shining beacon across the street if they wanted to survive in the eyes of the public. And Raymond Hood came up with this amazing idea. And I want to very briefly say a few words about Raymond Hood. And he's a really interesting figure. Here he is, Raymond Hood, in 1930. And he, in fact, what makes him so interesting, and I have to make a really big deal about it in this group because he went to Brown University. And here he is, of course, and you see him here as a member of Theta Delta Chi, his fraternity at Brown University in 1895. And so he studied architecture there, see him here right in front. And then he went to MIT and to the École des Beaux-Arts. And what always fascinates me when I look at him, he was born in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And so he goes to MIT, and then he goes to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the premier place where you would study architecture as an aspiring architect in the United States. And they would have a final project at the École des Beaux-Arts for the great competition for the Prix de Rome, the Great Rome Prize and so on, and everybody had to do a final project, and most architects there would design something like a classical Roman bath for a sort of fantasy antique city or something like that, and or a temple, or something that had to do with antiquity and with a long tradition in Europe. And Raymond Hood, as his final project, he designed a city hall for Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And it always, somehow, it moves me. It's so sweet, he's there in Paris, and what he thinks about is, and here it is. It's a beautiful thing. And he's already thinking vertically, and he tries that out as a skyscraper, and unfortunately not built, of course. It was just a final project for a student. But then he returns to Providence and says, you need a skyscraper too in the center of your city. And in fact, makes the headline of the Providence Sunday Journal with this wonderful, striking design for, this is what is now called Kennedy Plaza. And he designed this round courthouse for the heart of Providence in, I think the year is here, 1916. So it was very early. And also, it wasn't built, but at least, it made the Sunday edition of the Providence Journal. And it's quite beautiful. And it's exactly the spot where later, a few years later, the Superman building that you all remember, of course, from your time at Brown, the Industrial Trust, and then Fleet Bank, now it's Bank of America in the heart of the city, was built. So it's exactly the same spot. That was his entrance, very, very nice. And so Raymond Hood is really a very important figure, and he begins really his career in Providence at Brown, and then later with this skyscraper, and then designs this wonderful building here in Chicago. And so his idea was that he had to come up with a lighting scheme that was more interesting and more compelling than the Wrigley building right across the street. That was his intention. And so he, in fact, hires a lighting designer from Broadway, a theater lighting designer, a man called Bassett Jones. And they, when the building is finished, they climb up there behind those Gothic tracery windows and those enormous flying buttresses, and begin experimenting. And he says, there is a development that we haven't even looked at. There is really an amazing potential in lighting as an art. And he says there lies in the future development even more fantastic than anything that has ever been accomplished on the stage. And then he describes what he has in mind for the Chicago Tribune. And he says the whole effect will be that of Valhalla burning in the skies, bringing to mind perhaps the finale of the Götterdämmerung, with manual control, smoke boxes added, and mortars firing bombs from the tank roof. A most gorgeous display can be produced. And then they presented this scheme to the board of directors of the Chicago Tribune, and somehow they didn't fully understand why they would have sort of the apocalyptic finale of a Wagnerian opera up there playing at the head of the Chicago Tribune. So they didn't really go for it, but they decided to do something a little more sort of restrained and decent, something that looks somewhat close to what you see here in the postcard. And I thought I'll take you to Chicago here just for a second to show you what it looks like today in exactly this position. And I actually took this photo last year just before Christmas, so this is why the trees are all illuminated. And if we now look up, we see this is the lighting the way it looks now, and it is actually quite restrained and elegant, and it does something with the architecture. And in a way, I think we could argue that what our brown man, Raymond Hood, in fact did is much more sophisticated than just having an enormous flood of light thrown against the facade of the Wrigley building, as you can see here. In a way, it's a much more interesting and more thoughtful, elegant way, and I think he learned that at Brown, of course, that this is the way to handle things. If you look at this, it's much better there. So, and of course, this is really where architectural lighting and lighting as a work of art begins, as a sort of art tool in the hand of the architects. And then it takes off. If I just take you around here for a moment, if we look here behind me, this is one of the towers where the light emanates, as you can see here, against the facade. And then if we sort of go in here at the center and look at, there we go, buildings suddenly in the 1920s began to be illuminated because Raymond Hood had set the tone at the beginning of the 1920s, probably 1904, 1995. And here, look at this. Something, it looks as if somebody's playing Tetris there in the facade, a little computer game with the windows. And so this is really where everything begins. Before you all get seasick, I have to go slow here in this 360-degree photo. But so this is in a way the key moment where it begins, and of course from then it's so successful it takes off immediately. Raymond Hood and the theater designer Bassett Jones, they go on and design the lighting on the top of the American Radiator building. And of course, since they were selling radiators, it made a lot of sense to again experiment with steam and smoke and red color. And there are wonderful reports of how all the traffic jams on Fifth Avenue, which is right here. This is the public library, is right next to it, in New York, because they think the building is on fire. Actually, the fire trucks came out. And again, a sort of somewhat mellower version was chosen and has been reestablished. This is now a hotel. And in 1927, Georgia O'Keeffe saw this from her window, actually, and began painting this wonderful painting, American Radiator at Night. And it's a tribute to Raymond Hood, our Raymond Hood, I might say. And of course, she does something really interesting. Georgia O'Keeffe, you're all familiar with her work. And she does something interesting in the picture that most people don't know about who have only seen reproductions. She sort of takes this contrast that I talked about in the beginning at Times Square, the vulgarity of the written advertising, sort of in-your-face advertising, and the much more sophisticated theater in the air, advertising without words. And she takes that and basically makes it a theme in her picture, because her husband, the photographer Alfred Stieglitz, she always said, you have to advertise, Alfred. He had a gallery and nobody ever showed up, and it was, very hard for him to become known. And she always said, you have to advertise. And he never wanted to advertise his name and his work. He was sort of very restrained and reserved as a person. So what she did was actually she wrote in red letters here, Stieglitz, as a big advertising on the roof of one of the skyscrapers to sort of show him how it should be done. And in most reproductions, you can't actually see the letters very well. So this is why I had to point that out. As you can imagine, the industry, both those producing light equipment and, of course, those selling light as electricity companies, were absolutely happy about this development, that suddenly people began to illuminate whole buildings. And I found this wonderful quote in a correspondence among employees of an electricity company saying, if people begin to illuminate whole skyscrapers at night, this is using up as much electricity as 15 gas stations, 20 college football fields, 6 theaters all together. It's wonderful. They said, they're going to use up all this energy. And of course, the terracotta companies would jump in. And I love these. This is from different catalogs of, these guys make floodlighting projections and light bulbs and so on. And I love this photograph. It's actually very nice. This is the Chicago Tribune, as you can see here, the lighting of the Chicago Tribune. But you see there's sort of a little bit of a glow, but you don't see the Wrigley building across the street. And this is actually the only viewpoint where you can, or could at that point, photograph the Chicago Tribune without getting the Wrigley building in the way. And the reason why they chose that was that the Chicago Tribune building was lit by General Electric, but the Wrigley building was lit by Westinghouse, so they didn't want to, and so they just blocked it out. It's a very nice little detail. And then the electricity industry really jumped into this business and tried to educate the architects by telling them what a great tool light could be to enhance the architecture. They would build models and invite architects to see these skylines that they built in model form, big often, on a stage, for instance, where they would then change the light colors. You see here, the projection isn't very clear, but you see a sort of skyline and a skyscraper lit then in different colors, and the architects could say, oh, this is something I should plan for. And this is my favorite, the pièce de résistance. This is a great piece for the University of Light in Cleveland, here in Ohio, for General Electric in 1932, by their chief designer of models. Unfortunately, it's not there anymore. And they even made a film called Get a Load of It, meaning, spend a lot of energy on lighting a building. And the way they tried to educate architects was also by pointing out that they had to rethink their planning, because if you illuminated a building with floodlight, the light would come from underneath, as you've just seen in the example of the Wrigley building, would shine up usually from across the street, and it would mean that the shadows it casts are quite different from the shadows that are cast by light from above, right? So, and as an example, they would, for instance, show you the famous portrait of Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial by Daniel Chester French. And if you see here, if you look at this and you see this is sort of natural light from above, and they would point out natural shadows bring out forcefulness, kindness, and lifelike appearance. However, if you now imagine having light from underneath, from across the street, from a lower point, artificial floodlight, they point out this, in fact, reverse shadows give the appearance of fear or startled surprise. So that's not exactly what you want. And if you look at a Corinthian capital, typical ornament in a sort of classically inspired architecture, if the light comes from above, it looks actually pretty good. But if the light comes from underneath, it looks spooky, as did Abraham Lincoln, obviously. So you have to rethink the entire architecture. You have to simplify it, do away with classical ornament, and just have very simple modernistic facades. So suddenly the idea of illuminating a building at night became a driving force for stylistic change. And that is a very important issue. And of course, this movement spread throughout the 1920s and 30s all across the United States. And in fact, just for a little bit from my postcard collection, you see here, of course, wonderful examples. And here in town, of course, the Levesque building is another example that comes to mind, which has been beautifully lit now in the 1980s. Again, in the style that is very commensurate to what was done in the 1920s, where people, architects and lighting designers very quickly realized that, in fact, it was the setback skyscrapers that originally had been designed, of course, to let more sunlight into the streets. They were also very conducive for having floodlights sitting here on those setbacks, streaming up on the facade and giving buildings these wonderful, almost sort of painted facades. And as Raymond Hood here pointed out, the setbacks and terraces are ideal places for the operation of the lights. Raymond Hood was also the one who coined the term architecture of the night, which I used for this talk, and I love that term, of course, very much. And he, our Brown alumnus, created that. So it's a very, very interesting development, and a lot of theoretical debates going on. And in fact, one critic went so far, after looking at publications that looked at the American city in the future, such as this one here by Hugh Ferris, The Metropolis of Tomorrow, in which every single image showed the city, the imagined future American city at night, with floodlights streaming up the facades and casting shadows up on these wonderful buildings, as you can see here. This critic pointed out, Douglas Haskell wrote in The Nation, "Here is modernism indeed." And he said that basically light is what has changed the basis of all architecture. And then he points out, this is us. The Europeans get the day, we get the night. There is a nocturnal modernity that is truly American, he said. And I think this is a very important detail to remember. Of course, he's not quite right. The Europeans were interested in the night too. On the one hand side, they were forced to, of course, look at their cities at night in a different fashion during the First World War, where floodlights would, as I pointed out earlier, illuminate the sky to pick up, as in London, potential enemy aircraft. And of course, after the war, there were movements such as this one in Germany, where in fact architects were dreaming of a complete new beginning for architecture, where new spiritual buildings, and this is, I'm pointing this out because I believe that there's a very close proximity to what James Turrell is doing here in Columbus, where spiritual buildings, luminous from inside, would glow at night and provide for the, as one of the architects pointed out in these sort of visionary schemes, would provide for the lonesome wanderer a new experience of a new religion that was a religion of architecture and spatial experience at night. And he felt that could be the savior for mankind, which obviously had failed so miserably in their attempt at living peacefully together, as the war had just shown briefly before, and their wonderful schemes of luminous buildings on the tops of mountains here in the Alps by German visionaries. So all of these things happen in Europe, and of course European visitors would come sometimes to America and be rather sort of astonished about what they saw. And I just want to read you one quote. There's a German visitor, a socialist planner from Berlin, who comes to Chicago and of course goes and sees the Wrigley building and writes home to his friends and basically admonishes them and says, don't be too excited about the Wrigley building. He writes, and I found this in a German newspaper in his report, he said, when my German colleagues stand in front of a skyscraper and admire the enormous boldness of the human spirit, they forget that the only reason why someone can afford to have his 50-story building illuminated by batteries of searchlights is because he found innumerable men and women who bought his chewing gum from him and now go about their daily business chewing gum. So he was not happy, obviously, and And I think actually he was inspired by an essay that had been published a year and a half earlier by the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, who had actually written an essay and had argued that it was the chewing of chewing gum that kept the American worker from engaging in class struggle, because he was so distracted by the constant jaw movement that he couldn't concentrate on, being a revolutionary. So that was Trotsky's opinion. And this is still in German. I'm sorry, I didn't switch this from a German version. Others would in fact point out that the skyscrapers would be emasculated by the light, which made them too beautiful to really be taken seriously as office buildings. So there was a bit of tension in the approach, but of course the Germans also in their movies looked with great admiration to America and would, for instance, in that famous film Metropolis, look at the American future illuminated in this city by floodlights and advertising and movement, which became in a way, in the eyes of many Germans, as sort of example of the sort of overboarding energy of American capitalism. And when in the city of the future, Metropolis, in fact, the revolution breaks loose and all those enslaved workers try to break free, what in fact indicates this to the ruler who lives in the tallest tower right at the very top. Of course, what indicates that something is wrong is that in fact all the advertising goes completely crazy, as you can see here, and the floodlights play around, so he knows something isn't working out very well. So it's seen as sort of a symbol in a way of American capitalism as well in Europe, but nevertheless there were very serious attempts at somehow reining in advertising and illuminated writings on building facades at night. And so rather interesting moves happen here, and critics would point out that advertising has to be integrated into the facade, and light has to become a true element of architecture. And the result of these attempts is actually quite interestingly, although it looks different, similarly to the American approach in such a way that in fact, the consideration of light as a building material leads to a great simplification of the architecture, because they also realize if we have capitals or cornices or anything sticking out from the facade, is going to have an awkward shadow moving up. So again, modernity as a style is driven by the idea of what it looks like at night, which I think is quite interesting, and there are wonderful examples of these attempts at creating an architecture with a nocturnal appearance in mind. Then, of course, all these experiments end when the Nazis come to power, and they immediately use the sort of festive power of light for their mass gatherings of party members, and Hitler's megalomania, as you can see, of course, ended in the catastrophe of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and enormous destruction in European cities, and millions of lost lives and so on. All of this, of course, clearly related in a way to the use of the power of technology in the first place. So after the war, just very briefly, German immigrants come to the United States, and I'm thinking in particular of someone like Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who in fact then designs the Seagram building on Fifth Avenue together with a brilliant lighting designer, a man called Richard Kelly, and turns the whole building into a luminous shaft of glass, if you like, radiating light out at night, so that for the pedestrian the whole building seems transparent, translucent, lightweight. And that was a great sort of final response to all the fantasies that had been developed, that you could have bodies of light that would create a new presence in the nocturnal appearance of the city. And of course the sort of powerful presence of light as a tool to commemorate and to in fact give a symbol of great power of sort of mourning, in this case, in the very, very successful, I think, memorial for September 11th, is of course something that still has remained undiminished. But what I think is very important to learn from this story, as I come to my conclusive images, is of course that we have to be careful that the old juxtaposition that I pointed out in the beginning, that was discovered at Times Square in the 1920s, between the vulgarity and the overflowing power of advertising, and in fact the sort of artistic approach to the use of light in architecture, is something that we have to keep in balance. In fact, looking at these images of Times Square, I'm reminded of many comments that were made since the early 1990s that in fact advertising and lighting, especially advertising at night, is constantly taking over the architecture. And in fact, Paul Virilio already in 1991, great French critic, pointed out that we are now in the time of cinematographic factitiousness. From now on, architecture is only a movie. The city is no longer a theater, but the cinema of city lights. Or Robert Campbell, the great critic, architecture critic of the Boston Globe, wrote, and he was sort of a little bit at wit's end. You know, he says, the entire facade of a building from sidewalk to roof can be a digital screen that flashes ever-changing images. Is it the billboard? Is it architecture? Is it art? Who can say? Is this the world we're headed for? Will we even know anymore when we're in the real world or in a media simulation? Will that still be a meaningful distinction? All very good questions to ask, I think. And it's very rare to find someone like Robert Venturi, a fairly well-known architect, who wholeheartedly embraces the facade as a computer screen that is not just reflecting light but emanating light and imagining the building as a digital sparkling source of information. He sort of loves this idea of having a new iconography that is attached to buildings, but I personally feel there is a certain danger, in fact, in having advertising take over large parts of the architecture, and I think we need another movement. I think we're getting it from people like James Turrell. I'll return to in a second, of course. We need artists' involvement in reclaiming for us, of course, the spiritual power of light in the nocturnal environment. If you look around at Times Square, as we do now, you see how, in fact, the advertising is destroying the architecture, it's covering it up. It's completely unrelated to the architecture, as you can see here. And I don't think really it works very well as advertising either, because they are all sort of competing and in a way sort of with each other and destroying each other's message, as you can see here. And you can hardly recognize what the buildings really were for. And of course, the old idea that you have to integrate, if you do advertising, into the architecture has to be revived. And we need the voice of artists such as James Turrell to help us recognize that. And so if we look at a few examples of what artists have suggested to do, in the same vein as we saw how in the 1920s the abstract art of lighting was created as an answer to the vulgarity of Times Square, we have people like Anne Militello, the great lighting designer, who did this wonderful scheme of moving colors for this building just around the corner from Times Square that changes its rhythm and colors according to the time of the day and the day of the week, for instance. Or there's a wonderful example of UN Studio here, a group that turned the entire facade of a department store into a huge media screen in which colors can be displayed, or movies shown, for instance. Or there's this wonderful project by Jan Casalet for the office tower in Barcelona that is actually the administration for the waterworks of Barcelona. And the whole thing looks like a luminous fountain, if you like, as they already had them in the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. And Jan Casalet is also the one who did a project that I was reminded of by Turrell's project here in 1987, when he illuminated the Grand Palais in Paris, designed for the World's Fair in 1900, as a huge blue pulsating heart of the city of Paris, because he connected the lights to an atomic clock, and then you would see boop, 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 you know, blue lights getting stronger and less strong in the heart of Paris, and you could see that through that glass ceiling from everywhere in Paris. It was very, very impressive. And at the same time, James Turrell is developing very similar ideas, and we here profit, of course, from them. This, I think, is one of the first projects in '84, where in San Francisco he had a house, in fact, illuminated from the inside with this magical blue light that looked different at different times of the day, of course. Or there's this wonderful project in Leipzig in Germany in 1997, where a company, a sort of energy company for gas distribution, has a facade that changes its light in response, with a very complex computer program, in response to climate and weather and traffic and all kinds of outside sources that influence the appearance of this building at night. And here a wonderful project for a museum in Bregenz, where the glass skin is lit by James Turrell for a temporary installation at the opening of this building. Very, very successful as well, transforming the architecture into this glowing entity. And so I think Turrell is really the one who is closest to those visionaries in the early 1920s who had believed that the encounter with light can really mean a new sort of spiritual encounter with architecture. The nocturnal illumination of architecture can really introduce us to a new spiritual experience of these spaces. And he, in fact, talks about how, as in a lucid dream, you have a sharper sense of color and lucidity than with your eyes open. And he describes how he is interested in making the difference between inside and outside less clear through his work. And I think it's very convincing in what he did here, and a very important way of sort of regaining the spirituality of light. There's this famous quote from G.K. Chesterton, who in fact talked about the fact, he said, when he came to Times Square and saw all of this, he said, if I couldn't read, I would think I'm in heaven, you know. But of course, he could read and saw how banal and all the advertisings were. And so this idea of regaining the spirituality of light is very important. At the same time, I want to show you how artists are trying to regain the public spaces for light and advertising spaces in the hearts of the city. Berlin, once again, here a group of young lighting designers got a whole facade to work with, and with very simple elements showed simple films, very sort of grainy films, bringing us back to the origin of the medium, and even large eyes that would watch, in fact, the traffic in the city, and in a way bring a new sort of approach to this art of lighting that was very clearly setting a contrast to the high definition and bright colors of advertising screens that, of course, you also find in Berlin everywhere, or they would do the same to the skin of a museum in Austria, in Graz, where you see that the entire facade is, in fact, made up of these sort of neon light bulbs that you find in sort of average kitchen, and they would sort of connect them to a very complicated computer program, and then reflect, for instance, the water in front of the building, or send out messages or show images and so on. And by doing this, in a way, demonstrating that the involvement of artists can lead to something quite compelling and interesting. And their dreams for the future, which they learned by looking at the way the lights change over the course of the day and night in New York City, are interesting to look at. And I'll just quickly show you a short clip of what they thought one could do if one wanted to develop an architecture of the night further into the future. And they showed that at the Biennale in Venice last year would be to connect all the lights in a building, in the ceilings, on the desks of people, and create these light symphonies in the skins of skyscrapers, as you can see here, as a future for architectural lighting. If I imagine this, and I think it's a wonderful fantasy and a dream, but I'm not sure I would really want to see our skylines do something like this all the time, because it's rather exciting and distracting and perhaps a little much visually. And I think the path to go beyond sort of laying out dreams like this is, of course, the course that James Turrell has taken, with his clear interest in regaining access to the spirituality and the calmness of light that he provides with projects such as this. So I believe that the debate that we are in right now, that James Turrell is part of, and that many others are engaging in, this debate is reaching again the intensity that it had in the 1920s. We can learn a lot from historical precedents, I think, in understanding what the task and the potential of light as a building material really is. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Neumann. That was really wonderful. I'd like to have you have the opportunity to ask questions, but as sundown this evening is approximately 7:09, we would like to go ahead and head out to the West Pavilion so that we can actually see the Turrell installation as it comes on for the first time this evening. So we can continue our questions and discussion out there. Thank you so much.